What happens when absolute power meets unchecked ambition? Was Nero truly a mad emperor who watched Rome burn, or was he a misunderstood artist trapped in the role of a ruler? His name has echoed through centuries as a symbol of tyranny, extravagance, and scandal. But how much of what we know is fact, and how much is legend? In this video, we'll dive into the dramatic life of Nero, from his rise as the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty to the controversies, the fire that engulfed Rome, and the final days of a man who ruled an empire yet couldn't escape his own downfall. Get ready to explore one of the most fascinating and debated figures in Roman history and improve your English while doing it. Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15th, 37 AD, in the coastal town of Antium, modern-day Anzio, Italy, entered the world during a turbulent yet transformational time in Roman history. The Roman Empire, established just a few decades earlier by Augustus after the fall of the Roman Republic, was still in its formative stages, transitioning from a republican system of shared power to an autocracy dominated by a single ruler. Nero would eventually become the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a lineage that traced its roots to Julius Caesar and Augustus, and had already produced emperors with wildly varying reputations, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius among them. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a powerful and ambitious woman. She was the daughter of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, and the great-granddaughter of Augustus. Her ties to the imperial family gave her considerable status, but her life had been marked by political instability and loss. Her brother Caligula had become emperor in 37 AD, the same year Nero was born. But his erratic and cruel reign quickly led to unrest and his assassination in 41 AD. During Caligula's reign, Agrippina was exiled, and Nero's early years were spent away from the political spotlight. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, came from an old patrician family, though his reputation was questionable. According to the historian Suetonius, Domitius was arrogant, violent, and openly predicted that his son would grow up to be a public menace. He died in 40 AD, leaving Agrippina widowed and Nero fatherless at just 3 years old. In this politically unstable environment, Agrippina began to maneuver carefully, knowing that survival in imperial Rome required not only wealth and pedigree, but also cunning and alliances. The political landscape of the early empire was dangerous and often bloody. After Caligula's assassination, the Praetorian Guard installed Claudius as emperor, partly because they believed he would be easy to control. Claudius, an awkward and physically disabled scholar, surprised many by proving to be an able administrator. Agrippina, seeing an opportunity, set her sights on marrying her uncle, a controversial union even by Roman standards. Their marriage in 49 AD was both strategic and scandalous, but it accomplished Agrippina's goal, securing Nero's adoption and his placement in the line of imperial succession. In 50 AD, Nero was formally adopted by Claudius and given the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, aligning him with the Julian and Claudian bloodlines. From this point forward, Nero was groomed for power. He was named Princeps Juventutis, leader of the youth, and began appearing in public ceremonies. He became engaged to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, a political move that further strengthened his claim to the throne over Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. Agrippina went to great lengths to ensure Nero's ascendancy. She elevated her own position in the imperial court, appearing with imperial honors and even appearing on coinage, something no woman had done before in Roman history. As Nero grew older, she surrounded him with a carefully chosen group of tutors, including the Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, to mold him into a ruler of wisdom and restraint. Meanwhile, Rome itself was a city of contrasts, bustling with commerce and wealth, yet riddled with political intrigue and vast social inequalities. The Senate still existed, but its power had diminished under imperial rule. Gladiatorial games and public spectacles served to distract the population from growing economic challenges, and tensions simmered among Rome's diverse population of slaves, freedmen, citizens, and foreigners. When Claudius died in 54 AD, most likely poisoned by Agrippina to ensure Nero's succession, the 16-year-old ascended the throne as Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the fifth emperor of Rome. His rise marked a shift not only in imperial leadership, but in style and priorities. Whereas Claudius had focused on administration and expansion, most notably the conquest of Britain, Nero's early reign would be shaped by the influence of his mother and advisors, and later by his own personal desires and obsessions. In many ways, Nero's early life was a microcosm of the wider Roman world, a volatile mix of brilliance and brutality, high ideals and ruthless ambition. He was born into a dynasty that had revolutionized Roman politics and governance, yet was already beginning to unravel under the weight of corruption, conspiracy, and personal vendettas. These formative years, rich in privilege but fraught with manipulation and danger, laid the groundwork for one of the most infamous reigns in ancient history: education and influence. Agrippina ensured Nero received the best education possible, enlisting the help of the Stoic philosopher Seneca. Under Seneca's tutelage, Nero studied Greek, Latin rhetoric, poetry, and philosophy. Seneca, along with the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus, would become one of Nero's main advisors during the early years of his reign. While Nero was known for his love of the arts, music, and theater, these early influences attempted to instill in him a sense of Stoic discipline and justice. However, it was clear from a young age that Nero preferred artistic pursuits to the military and administrative responsibilities expected of a future emperor. He played the lyre, sang, wrote poetry, and even performed in public, a scandalous act for a Roman aristocrat, let alone a future ruler. Rise to power. Nero's rise to power was not a tale of destiny fulfilled, but rather the result of an intricate web of political manipulation, maternal ambition, and imperial opportunism. When Emperor Claudius adopted Nero in 50 AD, he was still a young teenager, promising, charismatic, and entirely shaped by the influences around him. Agrippina, his mother, had orchestrated the adoption meticulously, fully aware that Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, could still threaten her son's path to the throne. Her marriage to Claudius had not only given Nero legitimacy, but also placed her closer than ever to the center of imperial power. By all accounts, Agrippina was fiercely intelligent and deeply politically astute. Unlike other Roman women of her time, she did not settle for influence behind the scenes. She sought visibility and authority. She ensured that Nero received the finest education possible. Under the guidance of Seneca, a Stoic philosopher known for his moral teachings and rhetorical skill, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, Nero was groomed to become the ideal princeps. Virtuous, eloquent, and philosophically minded, Seneca taught him to speak with clarity and conviction, to value justice, and to govern with moderation, at least in theory. In 54 AD, when Nero was just 16 years old, Claudius died, allegedly poisoned by Agrippina herself with a dish of poisoned mushrooms. Ancient historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio do not hesitate to suggest that Agrippina engineered the emperor's death to fast-track her son's accession. Whether Claudius died of natural causes or through calculated murder remains debated, but the results were undeniable. Nero became emperor, the youngest to rule Rome up to that point. At the beginning of his reign, Nero presented a stark contrast to his predecessor. While Claudius had been awkward and reclusive, Nero was young, charming, and seemingly full of promise. He began his rule under the heavy influence of Agrippina, who assumed a quasi-co-regency. Her presence was so pronounced that during the early months of Nero's rule, she would sit behind a curtain during Senate meetings, reportedly guiding his decisions. Coins were minted featuring both Nero and Agrippina, something unheard of in Roman imperial imagery. Despite Agrippina's control, Nero's reign began with a surprisingly moderate and well-received tone. With the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, he enacted policies that earned him public approval. He lowered taxes, banned capital punishment for certain offenses, and emphasized public entertainment, winning favor among the Roman masses. He even declared, "I wish I knew nothing of writing," when asked to sign a death warrant, a sign perhaps theatrical of clemency. Yet the harmony would not last. As Nero matured and gained confidence, he began to chafe under his mother's domineering influence. Agrippina, used to controlling political affairs, now found herself sidelined by her own son. Nero began seeking autonomy, both personally and politically. His growing infatuation with a former slave girl named Acte infuriated Agrippina, who disapproved of the relationship and saw it as a threat to her authority. Their quarrels became public, and Nero gradually stripped his mother of her honors and influence. The young emperor also began to surround himself with advisors who encouraged his artistic inclinations and personal indulgences rather than his sense of duty. He developed a deep passion for music, poetry, and theater, which he believed were essential expressions of his soul, activities that Roman elites often considered inappropriate for an emperor. Nevertheless, Nero yearned to be loved not only as a ruler, but as a performer. Agrippina's fall from favor reached a turning point when she shifted her support to Britannicus, hoping to place him on the throne in Nero's stead. But Nero acted quickly and ruthlessly. In 55 AD, only a year after becoming emperor, Nero ordered Britannicus's assassination. During a dinner in the imperial palace, Britannicus drank a cup of poisoned wine and collapsed, dying in full view of the guests. Nero coolly claimed it was a seizure caused by epilepsy. With Britannicus gone and Agrippina increasingly isolated, Nero's grip on power tightened. His transformation from a puppet ruler under his mother's thumb to an increasingly authoritarian emperor had begun. In 59 AD, the final act of his break with Agrippina came in the form of matricide. According to multiple sources, Nero orchestrated an elaborate plan to murder her, first by sending her on a collapsible boat rigged to sink, and when that failed, by dispatching assassins to finish the job at her villa. Agrippina's murder shocked even Nero's supporters and confirmed to many that the emperor's darker tendencies were now unchecked. Yet despite the horror of matricide, Nero faced little immediate political backlash. The Senate, long accustomed to submission under imperial rule, praised Nero for eliminating a potential threat to the stability of the state. Propaganda swiftly recast Agrippina as overreaching and dangerous, and the empire moved forward under Nero's solitary rule. With his mother and political rivals eliminated, Nero stood at the height of his power, but also at the brink of a reign that would descend into infamy. He had begun his journey as a boy emperor with idealistic mentors and a polished image, but now, emboldened and increasingly erratic, he was free to indulge every desire and impulse, regardless of consequence. The rise to power of Nero was not just a story of political succession, it was a cautionary tale of how influence, ambition, and unchecked authority could shape a young ruler in profoundly dangerous ways. His early reign showed glimpses of potential greatness, but the seeds of tyranny had already been sown. A reign of excess and controversy. Neron's reign is often remembered not for its administrative achievements or military conquests, but for the overwhelming aura of decadence, theatricality, and cruelty that came to define his time in power. From the outset of his solo rule, after the elimination of Agrippina, the young emperor indulged in a lifestyle that many Roman elites considered scandalous and dangerous, one that was steeped in personal gratification and artistic obsession rather than imperial responsibility. Neron had an unusual preoccupation for a Roman emperor. He fancied himself an artist, particularly a musician, poet, and actor. He began performing publicly in ways that were considered entirely inappropriate for a man of his station. In Rome's deeply hierarchical society, emperors were expected to remain stoic, dignified, and detached from professions seen as lowly or Greek in character. Yet Neron often took to the stage, singing and playing the lyre, even competing in public contests. He saw himself as a gifted performer and demanded admiration and applause, often from an audience too terrified to offer anything else. The emperor's passion for performance was matched by his taste for extravagance. He spent vast sums on lavish banquets, personal luxuries, and massive building projects. Perhaps the most infamous of these was the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a grand palace complex constructed after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 A.D. This fire, which devastated much of the city, would become one of the defining controversies of Neron's reign. While the true cause of the blaze remains uncertain, many ancient sources accused Neron of either starting it or failing to act quickly to contain it. More damning were the allegations that he played his lyre and sang while Rome burned, a dramatic and likely apocryphal image that cemented his legacy as an uncaring, self-indulgent ruler. After the fire, Neron seized large swaths of the city's cleared land for the construction of his new palace, further fueling public resentment. Though he did initiate a new urban planning effort that introduced broader streets and more fireproof materials, his self-serving use of the disaster added to his image as a tyrant. To deflect blame, Neron turned public anger toward an obscure religious sect, Christians, marking one of the earliest recorded persecutions of Christians by the Roman state. He ordered mass arrests and executions, often in gruesome fashion. Some were crucified, others torn apart by dogs, or burned alive to serve as nighttime illumination in his gardens. This brutal scapegoating not only deepened fear of the emperor, but also added a religious dimension to his infamy. Another hallmark of Neron's reign was his erratic and violent treatment of those closest to him. His personal relationships were often marked by betrayal and bloodshed. After orchestrating the murder of his mother, Agrippina, Neron went on to abuse or eliminate others in his circle. He is believed to have had his first wife, Octavia, exiled and later executed under false charges of adultery, despite her popularity with the Roman people. His second wife, Poppaea Sabina, whom he deeply loved, died under suspicious circumstances. Ancient sources claim Neron struck her in a fit of rage while she was pregnant, causing her death, a tragic moment that even his contemporaries struggled to excuse. At the same time, Neron surrounded himself with sycophants and flatterers, while many capable and independent-minded senators were driven to suicide or killed. His court became a place of paranoia and spectacle, where philosophical dissenters like Seneca the Younger and other prominent Stoics found themselves at odds with the increasingly despotic regime. Seneca, once his tutor and advisor, ultimately committed suicide on the emperor's command, a symbolic break with the moral restraint that had briefly characterized the early years of his reign. The cultural transformation under Neron also reflected his eccentricities. He promoted Greco-Roman artistic ideals and launched the Neronia, a festival inspired by Greek models that combined athletic contests with theatrical performances and poetry recitals. However, many Romans viewed these activities as effeminate and unworthy of an emperor. The empire's military and political needs were increasingly neglected as the emperor focused more on art and indulgence, leaving provincial affairs in the hands of others. Perhaps most disturbingly, Neron began to blur the lines between public and private, fantasy and reality. He staged mock weddings, one of which was to a young boy named Sporus, whom he had castrated and dressed in the likeness of his late wife, Poppaea. These shocking acts were widely condemned by Roman historians and further cemented his image as a ruler untethered from moral or societal norms. As his reign progressed, rebellion began to simmer throughout the empire. While many in Rome continued to fear or obey him, discontent brewed in the provinces, especially among military commanders who saw the emperor's indulgences and lack of discipline as a threat to Rome's stability. These excesses and abuses of power would eventually lead to a series of uprisings and the erosion of his support among the legions, setting the stage for Neron's dramatic downfall. Despite his desire to be remembered as an artist and visionary, history largely recalls Neron as the archetype of the mad emperor, flamboyant, paranoid, and cruel. His reign of excess and controversy alienated both the Senate and the people, and although he commanded the most powerful empire of his time, he could not command respect or loyalty in the way his predecessors had. The Great Fire of Rome. One of the most catastrophic and controversial events of Nero's reign was the Great Fire of Rome, which erupted during the night of July 18th in the year 64 AD. The fire began in the commercial heart of the city, near the Circus Maximus, a crowded district of shops and tenements made mostly of wood. Fueled by dry summer winds and the tightly packed urban sprawl, the flames spread with terrifying speed, engulfing neighborhoods and reducing entire districts to ash. For 6 days, the fire raged uncontrollably before it was briefly halted, only to reignite and continue for another 3 days. By the time it was extinguished, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been affected, with 3 of them completely destroyed. Thousands were left homeless, countless public and private buildings were lost, and cultural landmarks were wiped from the map. The psychological toll on the Roman people was immense. along with the physical and economic devastation. The origins of the fire remain uncertain, and ancient sources provide conflicting accounts. Some, like the Roman historian Tacitus, openly admitted that no one knew for sure how it started. However, suspicion quickly turned toward the emperor himself. A popular rumor circulated that Nero, obsessed with urban redesign and the arts, had either ordered the fire to create space for his architectural ambitions or failed to intervene quickly enough because he saw opportunity in the destruction. Perhaps the most enduring and infamous image associated with the fire is that of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Although the fiddle, or violin, did not exist in ancient Rome, the metaphor lives on as a symbol of Nero's detachment and indulgence. Tacitus, considered one of the more reliable ancient historians, records that Nero was not in the city when the fire began. He was at his villa in Antium. Upon hearing the news, he supposedly returned to Rome and took measures to aid the victims, opening his private gardens to the homeless and arranging food deliveries. However, his later actions cast a long shadow over any goodwill these gestures may have generated. Rather than focusing solely on recovery, Nero seized large swathes of the devastated land in the center of the city to construct an opulent palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, spanning more than 100 acres and featuring artificial lakes, forests, a rotating dining room, and walls adorned with gold and precious stones. The Domus Aurea was less a residence and more a physical manifestation of imperial ego. To many Romans, it seemed that Nero had benefited too greatly and too conveniently from the disaster, fueling speculation that the fire had been premeditated. To divert public anger and suspicion, Nero sought a scapegoat. He chose a relatively new and increasingly unpopular religious group in the city, the Christians. Seen by many Romans as secretive, antisocial, and subversive for their refusal to worship the Roman gods or the emperor, Christians became an easy target. Nero accused them of arson and launched one of the earliest and most brutal persecutions of Christians in history. The reprisals were horrific. Christians were arrested en masse, tortured, and executed in grotesque public spectacles. Some were crucified, others sewn into animal skins and torn apart by wild dogs in the arena. Still others were coated in pitch and set alight as living torches to illuminate Nero's gardens during nighttime festivities. These events shocked even some of Nero's contemporaries, who regarded the emperor's punishments as excessive and inhumane, even if they were not sympathetic to Christianity. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero did initiate a large-scale rebuilding of Rome with a focus on safety and modernization. He implemented new building codes requiring wider streets, fire-resistant materials, and the inclusion of fire breaks between structures. While these reforms were sensible and beneficial in the long term, they were overshadowed by the trauma of the fire and the widespread belief that Nero had manipulated the tragedy for his own purposes. Ultimately, the Great Fire of Rome became a defining moment in Nero's reign, a turning point after which his popularity irreversibly declined. It reinforced perceptions of him as a decadent and untrustworthy ruler, someone who placed personal ambition and artistic vanity above the welfare of his people. Although later historians and scholars have debated the accuracy of these ancient narratives, recognizing that political motivations may have colored the accounts, Nero's association with the fire endures as one of the darkest symbols of his legacy. Decline and rebellion. The latter years of Nero's reign were marked by a steady unraveling of his power, fueled by political isolation, growing discontent among the elite, and widespread unrest across the provinces. After the fire of Rome and the increasingly erratic behavior that followed, Nero's relationship with the Senate and the aristocracy had soured beyond repair. His indulgences, massive spending on public works and personal pleasures, and the execution or exile of many senators and advisors had created an atmosphere of fear and resentment within Rome's political class. What had once been viewed as eccentric behavior now seemed tyrannical, even deranged. Nero's obsession with the arts, his performances as an actor, poet, and charioteer, was viewed with disdain by the Roman elite, who considered such pursuits beneath the dignity of an emperor. His lengthy tours of Greece, where he insisted on competing in and winning numerous artistic festivals, left Rome without leadership for extended periods and alienated even some of his former supporters. More critically, his absence emboldened rivals and sowed seeds of rebellion. The military, once a pillar of Nero's support, began to waver. Long campaigns and delayed payments tested the loyalty of legions. The situation reached a breaking point in 68 AD when Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis in modern-day France, led a revolt against Nero's rule. Vindex, who had noble Gallic blood and Roman citizenship, denounced Nero as a disgrace to the empire and called for the restoration of senatorial authority. Though Vindex's uprising was ultimately crushed by the forces of Lucius Virginius Rufus, the governor of Germania Superior, the rebellion marked a dangerous shift. Regional leaders were now openly challenging Nero's legitimacy. The decisive moment came when Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself a defender of the Senate and the Roman people, refusing to acknowledge Nero's authority. His move was not simply a political statement, it was a declaration of war. Sensing Nero's vulnerability, other provinces began to align themselves with Galba. The Senate, long cowed by Nero's unpredictable wrath, seized the opportunity to act. On June 8, 68 AD, they officially declared Nero a public enemy, a humiliating reversal for the man who once ruled as emperor and god. With his support evaporating, Nero found himself increasingly isolated. His Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal, was bribed to abandon him. Friends and courtiers fled or turned against him. Alone and hunted, Nero fled Rome and took refuge in the villa of a freedman outside the city. There, upon learning that his execution was imminent, he chose to take his own life. On June 9th, 68 AD, at the age of 30, Nero committed suicide by driving a dagger into his throat, reportedly muttering the words, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged the Roman Empire into a period of civil war and uncertainty known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Though his reign left behind a legacy of architectural innovation, cultural patronage, and lasting notoriety, Nero's final years were a stark testament to the corrosive power of autocracy, personal excess, and political paranoia. What had begun as a rule filled with potential and promise ended in chaos, betrayal, and one of the most dramatic downfalls in imperial history. Nero's cultural impact. Despite his infamous reputation, Nero left a lasting mark on Roman culture. His passion for the arts led to increased public engagement in music, theater, and games, though often at great cost. The Domus Aurea, with its revolutionary architecture, influenced later Roman building styles, even as his extravagance was widely condemned. In Christian tradition, Nero was remembered as a brutal persecutor. Some even speculated that he was the Antichrist, a belief that echoed for centuries. In modern times, Nero has become a symbol of absolute power gone wrong, his name synonymous with vanity, cruelty, and narcissism. However, recent scholarship has attempted to reevaluate parts of his reign, suggesting that many of the worst stories about him may have been exaggerated or politically motivated by senatorial sources hostile to the emperor. Nero's life is a tragic tale of wasted potential. Born into power and educated by some of Rome's finest minds, he had the opportunity to lead Rome into a golden age. Instead, he chose personal indulgence and artistic glory over the responsibilities of governance. His rule reminds us of the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of public favor, and the destructive potential of ego and paranoia. While history has painted him in dark tones, Nero remains one of the most captivating and enigmatic figures of the Roman Empire. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient history, don't forget to like, subscribe to Lingoverse, and hit the bell for more content. And remember, this channel isn't just about history, it's also a great way to improve your English through exciting storytelling. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.